Welcome to the Elixir podcast, where we ask people from all walks of life and from around the world what their favourite poem is and why it's important to them, why or how it speaks to their heart. You can find links to the poems on the podcast listing and on my website, helenwing.com.
Maybe out of habit, maybe out of sorrow. 仿佛重塑已星群 no longer have the strength to care, 或者由于习惯 about a destiny, 对自己已成的定局 they cannot alter, 再没有力量关怀。
Hello and welcome again to the Elixir podcast, which is a podcast where we ask people from all around the world if they have a poem that really moves them, and then we ask them why. Today we're talking to Lijia, who is from China. However, she lives in London. Hello, Lijia.
Hello, Helen. Lijia Zhang. Lijia is a very common name, you see.
It's absolutely lovely to have you here on our podcast today. Would you like to tell us which poem you're going to talk about, you're going to read to us?
I'm going to talk about a poem which I really loved when I was working in the factory. It's called On the Assembly Line of Time.
Okay, so would you like to read it to us first in English, please?
Okay, the poet is called Shu Ting, is a lady poet. On the assembly line of time, nights huddle together. We come down from the factory assembly line and join the assembly line going home. Overhead, the assembly line of stars trails across the sky. By our side, a young tree looks dazed on its assembly line. The stars must be tired. Thousands of years have passed. Their journey never changes. The young trees are ill. Dust and monotony deprive them of grain and color. I can feel it all because we beat to the same rhythm. But strangely, the only thing I do not feel is my own existence, as though the woods and stars may be out of habit, may be out of sorrow, no longer have the strength to care about a destiny they cannot alter.
Lijia, that's very, very depressing poem. Tell us why this poem means so much to you. Didn't you at some point work on an assembly line? Am I right about that?
Yes, indeed. Yes. So I read this poem in mid-1980s. I was working as a frontline worker at a military factory in my hometown, Nanjing. I was about 20, something around there, very young. But by then, I had already worked at the factory for 4 years. At 16, my mother just dragged me out of school and put me to work at this military factory that produced intercontinental missiles.
Wow. And you wrote a book about this, actually, didn't you? Socialism
Yes.
is Great, which is the story of your time in the factory.
Yes, exactly. Yes. And I wrote a memoir called Socialism is Great, in which I described my experience working at the factory. And you may ask why I became a factory worker at 16. I was actually a good student, but I was 16 and I was treated like a child. And in fact, I was quite childish, even though I did well at school. So we were poor. And my mother just took me out of school and put me to work, and she found another job. So for purely economic reasons.
When you say that she took another job, she gave you your job, is that right? She gave you her job.
Yeah, there was a policy because there was high unemployment. So China introduced a temporary policy which allow children to take over their parents' job if parents retired early. So my mother decided to take advantage of that policy. She retired and she found another job. So I started to work and I had to give all the money to my mother.
Oh, I wish my children gave me all their money.
So when I tell people that I work at a rocket factory, missile factory, people often say, wow, that must be fascinating. But I absolutely hated my work, which was my job. I was assigned to a job to test pressure gauges, pressure meters. The job was simple, repetitive, and so destroying.
When you found this poem, how did it make you feel? Did you think, oh, at least someone else feels like me? Or how did you feel when you read it?
Yeah, I felt comforted in some ways because I wasn't the only one there, and I just loved the poem because it just spoke to me. With 100 words, I couldn't have expressed the sense of drudgery I felt. So this poem just just spoke to me.
And
I guess
you felt recognized in that as well.
And I should explain what is misty poem. So it refers to a modern type of Chinese poems that burst into China's literary scene after the end of the Cultural Revolution. It was called misty, 朦胧诗, because some people complained that such poems were difficult to understand, as if they were shrouded in mist. So in 1979, Deng Xiaoping took over power and introduced reform, opening up. China became a bit more relaxed politically. So writers, and so there was a bit more freedom than compared to the political charged days under Chairman Mao. So under Mao, the poetry, like everything else, become part of the propaganda machine. Writers had to sing the praise of the party, things like Chairman Mao, you are our savior, party, we love you. So those called poems. So poems produced during those political charged years were more or less rigid and mechanized and with little or very no personal feelings or emotions or even imageries.
So were these poems called misty because people couldn't understand the sort of new feelings being expressed?
Yes. So under Mao, there was very little room for artistic freedom, creativity, or individualism. But I mean, then we have these misty poems. Through the mist, I saw a world of rich imagination, complex feelings, vivid symbols, and emotions that had never been explored in China.
Recognized, yeah.
Yes, yeah. I mean, poetry should be personal and marginal.
And when you discovered this poet was a woman, did you find that unusual, or were there lots of female poets at that time in China?
There were quite a few female poets, and Shu Ting was among the more successful ones, more famous ones. Yeah, she herself worked at the factory on the assembly line, so she was from her own experience.
Yeah.
Yeah, I found the poem simple and powerful.
And how did you find it? Did you find it in a bookshop, or did people pass it around the factory? How did you find that poem?
Oh, at that time, misty poems will become quite popular. So I bought quite a few with my very limited pocket money. I handed most of my salary to my mother. The leftover I used on books. Yes, I bought a collection of poetry, misty poems, and so on. At that time, lot more Chinese people don't read as much as poems as before. Back then, in the middle of the 80s, there was such a keenness for knowledge, and people read a great deal more. Distraction is social media and such.
And was that the same time as you started to come across foreign literature?
Yes, yeah.
As I remember you telling me that the novel Jane Eyre affected you greatly.
Yes, and also for the first time, classic works like Jane Eyre and great expectation and philosophical works like Nietzsche's God is Dead, or Freud's works have been translated into Chinese for the first time. Yeah, it was a very exciting time, very intellectually vibrant time.
So I have another question for you. Is there anything at all that you miss about your days in the factory?
I guess yes. I miss the days where people. I had some. My boss was very kind, and I think people, when life was hard, people were forced to rely on each other. And my boss was very kind at the factory, and I had some few female friends. We helped each other. We when I went out to meet boys, they'll lend me clothes and things like that. And then with my neighbors, we round of rice, round of eggs, you borrow each other. So borrow things from each other. I guess that, yes, the relationship among people was warmer, I would say, because people were forced to kind of, in order to survive, you have to rely on each other because resources were so limited.
Yeah. And you also knew you had that shared and common boredom, because when you've described that in the past, it's just the utter boredom of doing the same thing over and over again.
Yeah, well, different levels of boredom. Many of my colleagues waste their time kind of smoking, drinking tea and talking rubbish. And for me, just a waste of time. Shall I read that in Chinese?
Yes, please do. That would be lovely if you could read it to us in Chinese.
It's called 流水线 in Chinese. 流水线，在时间的流水线里，夜晚和夜晚紧紧挨着。我们从工厂的流水线拆下，又以流水线的队伍回家来。在我们头顶，轻轻的流雪声拉开天穹，在我们身旁，小树在流雪线上发呆。星星一定疲倦了，几千年过去了，他们的旅行从不更改。小树都病了，烟尘和单调使它们失去了线条和色彩。一切我都感觉到了，凭着一种共同的节拍。但是奇怪，我唯独不能感觉到的是我自己的存在，仿佛重塑以星群，或者由于习惯对自己已成的定局，再没有力量关怀。It's quite interesting, the last line of the poem is about no longer have the strength to care about a destiny they cannot alter. But I'm very pleased to say I was able to change my destiny.
You certainly were able to change your destiny. In fact, just recently, you and I went to listen to another poet who has arguably had a life also of drudgery and boredom in lots of ways. And we went to see her just last weekend at the British Library. And her name is Wu Xiuhua. And her boredom, if you like, is to do with being stuck in the countryside in poverty, so that there were very little resources.
She's suffering from, she has difficult speech and mobility difficulties.
That's right. She has cerebral palsy as well. So she left school very young. Yeah. And really poetry for her has been a lifeline.
Poetry has been lifeline. Words has been lifeline to her, yeah.
And she actually reminds me of quite an old English poet called John Clare, because he was a country poet, and he was taken up by the poetry intelligentsia, if you like, for a while with his country poems. And that's the impression I had of this lovely Chinese woman, Wu Xiuhua, who seems to have been taken up by, well, first of all, she shot to fame over the internet, and then she's been taken up by sort of these global intellectuals who are taking her and teaching her to dance and taking her around the world and showing her a life that I think she probably never dreamt she would be able to have. And but she's maintained her sense of humour and her ability to, she seems to have vast psychological ability to cope with anything the world throws at her. So it was lovely to see her. And it's also, I must say, Lijia, this is one of the things that I've always appreciated about you, is your ability to to cope with any situation that is thrown at you and come through it. And maybe, maybe being in a factory did it for you, taught you that. Maybe you learned that resilience,
Life hasn't been easy, and I suffered many setbacks in both professional and private lives.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess, yes, so things haven't come easily for me. So I guess that taught me to be resilient, I guess.
Mm-hmm. So you managed to throw off the fatalistic view at the end of the poem.
Yes.
Yes.
So I found the strength to care about my existence. So that's something like.
But also that poem sort of it inspires the outrage, doesn't it? That you read that and you think, your response to it is, no, I am someone. I do have a future. I can forge my life,
So I have to say that I was lucky, yes, because China was changing Deng Xiaoping introduced reform opening up and China opened up. So yeah. There's a lot more opportunities, yeah. So I always think I'm lucky. Just back on Yu Shuhua, you won't believe this, Helen. May, my older daughter, May, the actress daughter, she spent a week with Yu Shuhua and the dancing troupe because there may be an opportunity for her to play a role there.
Oh, wow. Has she just done that? Or is she going to do that? She's just done it.
She was there. I told her, she said that she spent a week with her.
Fantastic. Wonderful. So how all things are connected. Lijia, thank you so much for coming to our podcast, Elixir. As a final part, I'd really love it if you could read it again so that the listeners can listen to it, knowing that you have gone through and experienced something very, very similar in your youth. So could you read it one more time for us, please?
My pleasure. On the Assembly Line of Time by Shu Ting. Nights huddled together, we come down from the factory's assembly line and join the assembly line going home. Overhead, assembly line of stars trails across the sky. By our side, a young tree looks dazed on its assembly line. The stars must be tired. Thousands of years have passed. The journey never changes. The young trees are ill. Dust and monotony deprive them of grain and color. I can feel it all because we beat to the same rhythm. But strangely, the only thing I do not feel is my own existence, as though the woods and stars, maybe out of habit, maybe out of sorrow, no longer have the strength to care about a destiny they cannot alter.
Oh, that's wonderful. You read that beautifully, Lijia, and it's such a moving poem, and I feel really privileged that you've shared that with us. And it gives people all over the world an insight into the lack of choice that people suffered in those days.
Actually, yes.
So thank you very much for coming on to the Elixir podcast.
Thank you for having me.
I'd just like to remind our listeners that there are links to the poems that we're reading on my website, helenwing.com, and you'll be able to find those links also in the description of the podcast, wherever you're listening to it.